Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Lewis sat near the back, shoulders squared, tablet in hand, every line of her posture disciplined, controlled, unreadable. Around her, the conference room buzzed with energy, men joking, boots scraping, names being called out for the day's training exercise. She listened, silent, her pen tapping against the edge of her tablet, but her name never came up. It almost never did. And yet, beneath her calm exterior, her mind ran hotter than the fluorescent lights above. It wasn't that they disliked her. Not really. The men at Fort Sterling didn't spit in her direction or shove her aside in the mess hall, but they never saw her either, not in the way that mattered. To them, she was quartermaster, the one who counted bullets, logged their numbers, and handed out weapons for the real soldiers to use. She was 23, small, sharp-featured, her Welsh accent softened by years of careful restraint. Her hands, steady hands, precise hands, moved over weapon systems daily. Rifles that thundered across valleys, sidearms that could determine the fate of a man in a split second, ammunition crates worth more than anyone's pay for the year. She logged every piece, tracked every lot number. Not a single bullet slipped through her system unnoticed. And still, none of that mattered. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she had been shooting long before most of them could drive. On her grandfather's windswept farm inn, she had learned the weight of a rifle not as a tool of war but as a necessity of survival. Foxes after the sheep, rabbits after the crops, poachers who came under cover of fog. Her grandfather's old had steadied in her hands at 12 years old, and by 16 she had outshot men twice her age in village competitions. But that history didn't fit into her uniform. Here, it didn't matter that she could thread 3 bullets through a single hole at 200 meters. She was certified. She was selected. She was one of them. The Irish voice at the front of the room broke her thoughts. Major, precise and brisk, commanded attention with every word. Today's exercise is advanced long-range marksmanship training. Targets set between 800 and 1,200 meters, mountain terrain, shifting wind. Preparation for the Allied Command evaluation next month. His pen froze on the tablet screen. The Allied Command evaluation. The competition every marksman on the continent dreamed of. Recognition, assignments to elite sniper units, opportunities to rewrite careers. Names rolled forward, Mitchell, each one spoken like they carried destiny, and then Lewis, ammunition expenditure tracking, post-exercise weapon maintenance. Her throat tightened, but her face betrayed nothing. The tablet glowed beneath her hand, ready for numbers she already knew by heart. Around her, the chosen men grinned at one another, excited for the chance to prove themselves. They didn't look back at her. She might as well have been a chair. When the meeting ended, she walked in silence to the armory. The .50 caliber rifles waited in their padded cases, weapons of myth, sleeping giants of steel and glass. She laid her hands on one, gentle but firm, and ran her fingers along the scope mount, the bolt action. She knew this rifle better than anyone else here. She had memorized its ballistic coefficients, scope adjustments, the whisper of its recoil. But she had never been permitted to fire it. Instead, her role was to prepare the weapons for men who would misuse them, to clean them after their mistakes, recalibrate what they had knocked out of alignment, repair what they had damaged through carelessness. Every evening, she put the rifles back together with the quiet patience of someone who understood them better than their owners. And still, no one asked her to step behind the scope. That evening her patience cracked. She overheard them, Mitchell. Voices drifting through the armory walls as she cleaned Mitchell's rifle, the one he had used to miss 3 targets in a row at 800 meters. Mitchell's grouping was all over the place today, muttered. If that's our best for the evaluation, replied, we're going to embarrass ourselves. Then the laughter. At least he can handle recoil. Did you see Lewis? Standing there taking notes like she thought she could do better. Maybe she can count her way to accuracy. Their voices faded down the hall, leaving only the metallic scent of oil and gunpowder and the pulse of her own heartbeat. She stood still, her hand clenching the cleaning rod until her knuckles whitened. She could see every shot they had missed, every wind correction they had failed to make, every adjustment they had overlooked. In her head, she made the calculations, aligned the crosshairs, fired the perfect rounds. But in reality, no one would give her the chance. The pattern had been there since her first week, her name absent from every roster, her requests for training quietly dismissed, her applications returned with polite denials about essential personnel and limited slots. And always the same men chosen, even as their skills stagnated, even as Fort Sterling's performance fell behind smaller bases with fewer resources. She had reports to prove it, data, accuracy percentages, ammunition waste, repair logs, 30% more rounds fired than necessary, thousands of pounds of equipment damaged from poor handling, all of it documented, submitted, ignored. Stay in your lane, that was the message. But Lewis had never been good at lanes. Every night while others slept, she studied ballistic tables, terrain maps, weather data. She learned to read wind and pressure as easily as some read faces, and on weekends in the deep valleys of Wales she trained with her own rifle, not that she could not touch, but a civilian precision build she had assembled piece by piece, paid for with overtime shifts and quiet determination. She fired in rain, fog, high wind, across ravines, from angles no training manual taught. She had built her own sniper school in the shadows of rejection. And yet a question gnawed at her. Would it matter? Could preparation ever mean anything if no one gave her the chance to prove it? The answer came one morning, crisp air, sunlight spilling across the Welsh mountains, his voice at the front of the room again. The Allied command evaluation has been moved up 2 weeks. His pulse quickened. 2 weeks. After 18 months of waiting, this could be the opening. Selection trials this Friday, open to all qualified marksmen with current certifications. The words fell like ice water. Certifications, the bureaucratic wall she had never been allowed to climb. She raised her hand anyway. Ma'am, what about personnel who haven't had the chance to obtain those certifications, but who possess the skills? The room went quiet. Soldiers turned to stare, some with amusement, some with disbelief. The voice was calm but firm. The certifications exist for a reason, Lewis. She pressed on. What if someone could demonstrate those capabilities during the trial itself? Wouldn't actual performance matter more than paperwork? Mitchell's laugh cut across the silence. With respect, Lewis, these competitions aren't for ammunition clerks who think counting bullets makes them snipers. The smirks around the room stung sharper than any bullet wound. His final words sealed it. Enthusiasm noted, but the criteria are non-negotiable. Mitchell, you're the team. 3 names, 3 failures waiting to happen, and still they were chosen. Walked out of the briefing room like a ghost. 18 months of study, a lifetime of skill, dismissed with a smile. That night she stood at the perimeter fence, staring out at the golden wash of the mountains, the peaks catching fire in the sunset. She thought of the sheep pastures of her childhood, the echoes of her grandfathers cracking across valleys. Perfect shooting weather. Always perfect shooting weather. And she thought, maybe they'll never see me. Maybe they'll never give me the chance. But she had not prepared all these months to fade into silence. She had prepared because she knew one day opportunity would arrive, and when it did, she would be ready. What she didn't know then was how violent, how sudden, and how irreversible that moment would be. Because when Admiral Harrison arrived at Fort Sterling, everything changed. How much can a soldier hide before the walls close in? Asked herself that question often in the weeks that followed. Every night she told herself her preparation was nothing more than dedication. Every hour logged in the depot's weather station, every file downloaded from the base's archives, every quiet evening spent cross-referencing ammunition performance against conditions. It was all harmless. It was all to make her better at her official job. At least, that's what she told herself when doubt crept in. But the truth was more dangerous. 3 times a week, she volunteered for overnight ammunition security shifts. Extra pay, she explained to her supervisors. Dedication, she called it. And it was true, but not the whole truth. In those long, quiet hours surrounded by crates and steel, she opened files most clerks never touched. She read the patterns of crosswinds across the Welsh mountains, studied how temperature shifts twisted trajectories, how humidity swallowed precision. She ran simulations against 5 years of training data stored in the depot's systems, charting where every bullet had landed against whether logs no one else had bothered to analyze. Patterns emerged, ugly patterns. Fort Sterling's elite shooters weren't missing because of bad luck. They weren't missing because the mountains were unforgiving. They were missing because they didn't understand the science. They guessed wind instead of measuring it. They treated marksmanship like an instinct instead of an engineering discipline. She memorized their mistakes, one by one, and she swore she would never make them. But studying wasn't enough, not for her. Every weekend she slipped away to the valleys where she had first learned to hold a rifle. The family farm was long sold, but the mountains remained, vast and indifferent, their ridges cutting against the horizon. Out there, with a rifle she had built herself, a .338 Magnum she had saved for piece by piece, she practiced until her shoulders ached, until her breathing synced with the wind, until she could close her eyes and see every shot before it left the barrel. She trained in rain when visibility collapsed. She trained in mist when distance blurred. She trained on cliff edges in shifting gusts, firing across valleys where echoes took seconds to return. What Fort Sterling her, the mountains gave freely. And yet every time she chambered a round, a thought gnawed at her. Would this ever matter? Inside the base, the walls of bureaucracy thickened around her. Paperwork was stacked against her future, certifications locked behind doors she wasn't allowed to enter. No matter how many nights she stayed awake memorizing ballistic charts, no matter how many weekends she drove into the countryside to perfect her technique, her file still said ammunition clerk. But what if someone noticed? The first crack appeared during a routine inspection. Sergeant Major Williams stood in the depot doorway one morning, his face harder than usual, a tablet clutched in his hands. "Lewis," he said, "we need to talk about your access logs." Her heart stuttered. She forced her face to stay neutral. "What kind of irregularities, Sergeant?" He scrolled slowly, as though savoring her discomfort. Multiple overnight sessions, accessing technical materials outside your authorization level, extended hours in the depot far beyond your assigned shifts. Her pulse pounded. Every word was true, but every word was missing the truth. "I've been studying ballistic data," she said carefully, "to improve ammunition management efficiency. Different rounds perform differently under weather conditions. If I understand that, I can make better recommendations for inventory distribution." Williams's eyes narrowed. Ammunition clerks don't need to understand ballistics. They count, they log, they distribute, that's it. The words landed heavier than any order he'd ever given her. Her competence, the thing she had clung to like armor, was now her liability. In the days that followed, she felt it everywhere. Conversations stopped when she entered the mess hall. Equipment requests dragged in processing. The sideways glances from her peers said it all. She's too ambitious. She's reaching above her station. One afternoon, she caught their whispers. Standing by the mess hall tray line, she froze when she heard Corporal Davies' voice from a nearby table. She spends all her time buried in ballistic charts, asking questions about procedures she's got no business knowing. Another soldier's voice was softer, uncertain. "Maybe she's just dedicated." Davies scoffed. "Dedicated is one thing. She's digging into training schedules, competition protocols, even weather reports. Looks to me like she's building a case, probably planning to complain about not being selected." The words seared through her. She stood frozen, tray in hand, invisible but exposed. Months of work, months of sacrifice being twisted into suspicion, reframed as subversion. It got worse. A week later, Major summoned her. The office smelled of paper and polish, her desk covered with files thicker than any personnel review should have required. "Lewis," began, her tone cool, controlled. "Your technical competence is excellent. Your logs are flawless. Your equipment maintenance exceeds expectations." The pause came sharp, but continued, "Your focus extends beyond your responsibilities. Independent research, questions about procedures, accessing data outside your clearance, that creates concern." Sat rigid, her voice low but steady. "Ma'am, understanding the broader context makes me more effective." "The broader context isn't your concern," snapped. "Your concern is counting rounds, distribution, inventory. That is your role. And when personnel stray outside their lane, it raises questions about loyalty, about intentions." Her chest tightened. Loyalty, intentions, words that hinted at something darker than reprimand. "I want your assurance," finished, "that you'll stop pursuing research beyond your duties. No more independent study. No more questions outside your role." It was a request and an order and a warning. His jaw clenched. "I understand, ma'am." But understanding and obeying were not the same. She left the office with her world narrowing around her, walls closing with every step. Her knowledge was no longer her weapon. It was evidence against her. Her preparation, her ambition, her hunger for excellence had been recast as threats. The confrontation she feared most came a week later. A tribunal in all but name sat at her desk, Williams on one side, captain from base security on the other. It felt like judgment before trial. "Lewis," said, her tone stripped of familiarity, "we need to address concerns about your behavior." Williams flipped open a thick folder. Unauthorized access, extended hours, questions about operational procedures outside your scope. Leaned forward, his words cutting like steel. Pattern recognition suggests intelligence gathering or preparation for unauthorized activity. Stomach dropped. Her training, her study, her desperate effort to matter being twisted into the language of treason. "Sir," she said, forcing calm into her voice, "I studied to make myself better at my duties. Understanding how equipment is used makes me more effective." "Not your call to make," Williams shot back. His eyes pinned her in place. "Your dissatisfaction with assignments has been noted. Your comments about selection decisions suggest insubordination." It spiraled fast, everything she had done reframed as threat, every question twisted into disobedience. Finally, delivered the verdict. "Effective immediately, your access is revoked. No more technical materials beyond basic ammunition specs. Your clearance reduced. Any deviation from duties must be pre-approved. Any further evidence of behavior outside your role, disciplinary action. Court-martial if necessary." The room held its breath. "Do you understand, Lewis?" She looked at each of them. Williams satisfied, cold, weary but unyielding. They thought they had contained her. They thought they had locked her back into her box. "I understand perfectly, ma'am," she said. But her understanding wasn't the same as their intent. When she left the office, she carried more than orders. She carried a choice. She could submit, let her skills wither in silence, live her days as the forgotten quartermaster, or she could keep preparing, keep training, keep sharpening herself against the mountain winds even if no one ever saw it. And though she didn't know it yet, the choice she made would soon collide with an arrival no one expected. Because the next week, Admiral Harrison, the highest marksmanship authority in Allied command, stepped onto Fort Sterling's parade ground. And nothing after that would ever be the same. What happens when truth collides with power? The base felt different the morning Admiral Harrison arrived. Crisp air bit through the Welsh mountains, their peaks washed in silver frost. Soldiers who normally dragged their boots hurried, their uniforms sharper, their words clipped and formal. The weight of authority carried across the parade ground before the man himself even stepped out of the transport. Had heard of him long before she saw him. Harrison, 62 years old, a living legend. A man whose marksmanship records were whispered across Allied command like scripture. To younger shooters he was myth. To commanders he was both judge and executioner. When bases failed to meet expectations, he appeared not as a guest but as an investigation. And Fort Sterling had been failing for years. Stood at the back of formation as he walked the line, inspecting, nodding occasionally, his eyes sharp with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime judging the difference between competence and excuse. His uniform was immaculate, his medals heavy, but it was his gaze that unsettled the base. He didn't look at them like personnel. He looked at them like weapons, measuring, weighing, calculating whether they were fit for purpose. The demonstration was supposed to reassure him. It did the opposite. Mitchell took the first shots, the thunder echoing across the range. His first round missed entirely. The second landed wide. The third clipped the edge far from the center. Spotting calls were inconsistent, vague corrections shouted with false confidence. Fumbled the rifle between positions, scope misadjusted, handling sloppy enough to make veterans wince. At 1,200 meters, the results were worse. Shots scattered wide, some missing the frame completely. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. Stood at the periphery, clipboard in hand, recording the waste of ammunition she had predicted before they even started. Each miss felt personal, not because she had taken the shot, but because she knew exactly how to have hit it. Harrison's jaw tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the air like a rifle crack. "Major, I need to speak with whoever is responsible for ammunition selection and ballistic calculations." The words sent a tremor through the command staff. Hesitated. The truth was clear. The only one who had the answers he wanted was the very person they'd worked hardest to silence. After a quick exchange with Sergeant Major Williams, relented. "Lewis," she called, "step forward." The air shifted, every pair of eyes turned toward her. The clerk, the quartermaster, the one who wasn't supposed to matter. Stepped out, boots crunching against gravel, her body composed but her pulse racing. She saluted. "Sir." Harrison studied her with unnerving focus. "I'm told you manage ammunition here." "Yes, sir." "Explain to me why these rounds are producing inconsistent results." She looked at the scattered targets, at the rifle, at the thin mountain wind cutting across the range. The errors leapt out to her immediately. "Sir, the ammunition selected is inappropriate for today's conditions. The 750 grain match rounds perform well in stable temperatures, but the 15-degree drop since yesterday required 800 grain. The scopes weren't adjusted for the change in barometric pressure. Environmental compensation wasn't applied." A hush rippled across the formation. Technical, precise, undeniable. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "And you determined this how?" "By correlating ballistic performance with current environmental factors. Sir, ammunition selection must match conditions, not standard loads." The Admiral turned, scanning the targets again. His silence was long, deliberate. Then, "Lewis, show me what you mean. Make the corrections and demonstrate." The words hit like detonation. Stiffened. "Sir, with respect, Lewis is not a certified marksman. She lacks the training and qualifications to—" Harrison cut her off, voice edged with disbelief. "Major, your certified marksman just missed half his targets at operational range. Your ammunition specialist explained the problem in 30 seconds. Are you suggesting paperwork matters more than results?" Williams stepped forward quickly, a man clinging to protocol like a shield. "Admiral, safety regulations prohibit unqualified personnel from—" "Qualified," Harrison snapped. I just watched your qualified personnel mishandle equipment like recruits. Do not talk to me about qualifications. Felt every heartbeat in her throat. The rifle waited on the bench, massive, powerful, familiar to her in every way except the one that mattered. She had never been allowed to fire it here. Not once. Mitchell's voice broke through, dripping with contempt. Sir, with respect, she's an ammunition clerk. Maybe she knows theory, but firing under pressure isn't the same as studying charts. His words lit the air with bitter irony. He had failed under pressure for years, and yet still clung to the belief that his title made him untouchable. Regained her voice. Sir, even if she understands, we cannot allow unauthorized personnel to fire precision weapons in official demonstrations. The liability. Harrison's patience snapped. His voice dropped to the dangerous calm of a man who rarely repeated himself. Major, I am the highest marksmanship authority in Allied command. I am authorizing this demonstration under my supervision. If she fails, the consequences are hers. If she succeeds, the consequences are yours. The range fell silent. His breath caught. It was here. The moment she had prepared for in shadows, prayed for in silence, doubted would ever come. One chance. No second attempt, no private proving ground. Every eye on the base was locked on her. Harrison's gaze met hers. Lewis, do you believe you can demonstrate proper technique with that rifle? She looked at the scattered targets, the sneers of men who had laughed at her for 18 months, the faces of leaders who had locked her away in a role too small for her. Yes, sir, she said, her voice steady. I can. Williams's protest rose again, desperate. Admiral, this course of action. I've heard enough, Harrison said sharply. He gestured to the rifle. Lewis, show them what happens when preparation meets opportunity. The weight of it pressed down on her. She stepped forward. Her boots felt heavier than ever, each step carrying the weight of years of dismissal, laughter, invisibility. She laid her hands on the steel was cold, familiar, alive. For the first time in uniform, she was allowed to hold it not as a custodian, but as its wielder. The silence stretched as she settled behind the scope, her body flowing into position with the grace of endless practice. She chambered a round, adjusted the scope with precision that betrayed intimate knowledge, and steadied her breathing. Harrison's voice was quiet, testing. What are the conditions, Lewis? She didn't need to look at instruments. Variable wind 3 to 5 miles from northwest, 42 degrees, humidity 68, barometric pressure stable at 30.15. The accuracy silenced the murmurs. Target, he asked. She didn't hesitate. 1,200 meters, bullseye. Gasps broke around her. The very target Mitchell had missed again and again. Her first official shot, aimed at the most unforgiving mark. Williams whispered too, panicked. This is insane. She'll embarrass herself. She'll ruin the weapon. But Harrison's hand rose. Fire when ready. The wind whispered across the mountains. His heartbeat slowed. The world narrowed to crosshairs, distance, calculation. She squeezed the trigger. The roared thunder cracking across the valley, dust exploding from the bench. The round screamed through air and silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. Downrange, the target snapped, dead center. A perfect bullseye. What if the first shot wasn't luck? The question hung in the cold mountain air, unspoken but alive in every glance, every stiff breath around the firing line. Soldiers who had mocked her, ignored her, dismissed her as nothing more than a quartermaster now stared at the distant target and back again, as though their eyes had betrayed them. Admiral Harrison's silence was heavy, deliberate. Then he spoke. Again. Chambered a second round. The movement was smooth, practiced, too practiced for someone who was supposed to be unfamiliar with the weapon. Her fingers knew the steel the way a pianist knows keys, each touch precise, measured, intimate. The wind had shifted slightly. She adjusted the scope half a click, her breathing even. The world narrowed again to heartbeat and target, a tunnel of mathematics and instinct fused into one. The shot cracked through the valley. The muzzle blast rolled back across the range like thunder. The target twitched. Another bullseye. The round had landed so close to her first that the holes almost touched. A twin flame burned into steel. A ripple passed through the crowd, not cheers, not applause, but the murmur of disbelief, of a worldview fracturing in real time. Mitchell's face had drained of color. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the targets and the woman behind the rifle, as though searching for some trick, some illusion to explain the impossible. Didn't look at them, she couldn't. Her eyes stayed locked on the crosshairs, her body taut with controlled stillness. But inside, emotion surged. Anger, vindication, relief so sharp it felt dangerous. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times alone in the Welsh valleys. She had seen herself hitting these targets, seen the shock on the faces around her. But imagination had never carried the weight of reality. This wasn't a dream, this was happening. "Third target," Harrison ordered quietly. She adjusted. The conditions had shifted again, barely perceptible. To most, the wind was just a whisper, a breath across the range. To her, it was data. She felt it against her cheek, measured its push against her collar, read the grass bending in uneven patterns. She calculated drift without thinking. It had become instinct, buried in muscle memory from nights of practice no one had seen. She fired. Another bullseye. The silence was electric. The third hit shattered the last refuge of doubt. One shot might be luck. 2 shots could be chance. 3 consecutive perfect hits at 1,200 meters under variable wind. That was mastery. Admiral Harrison allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of it pressing down on every officer, every soldier who had looked at Lewis and seen only limitation. His voice, when it came, carried not anger but something colder, judgment. "Major Sergeant Major Williams, Captain, what excuse do you have now?" His throat tightened. "Sir, she still lacks proper certifications. Regulations require." "Regulations," Harrison cut in sharply. "Your regulations produced incompetence. Your certifications gave authority to men who cannot hit targets under ideal conditions. Meanwhile, the woman you buried in a depot just demonstrated skills that surpass your entire team." The rebuke was surgical, devastating, flinched as though the words themselves were blows. Williams tried to recover, his voice strained. "Sir, even if she demonstrates accuracy, she has no experience working under operational stress. Shooting on a range is different from combat." Harrison turned on him, his gaze unforgiving. "What I just witnessed was stress. A woman dragged from obscurity, handed a weapon in front of her entire chain of command, ordered to perform under the eyes of Allied command. That is pressure. And she delivered." His words cracked the air. The command staff shifted uneasily, but none dared argue further. "Again," he said, nodding at. She obeyed. A 4th shot. 5th. 6th. Each one a mark of precision, each one tightening the invisible noose around the base's authority. The shots became rhythm, a cadence of inevitability. By the time the 12th round echoed across the range, 11 were perfect bullseyes. The single outlier landed less than an inch from center, still more accurate than anything Mitchell had produced in months. When the last casing clinked against concrete, eased the rifle down with reverence. Her hands shook faintly now, the adrenaline flooding in, her body catching up to the weight of what she had just done. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, Harrison broke it. "Major, you've been excluding your best shooter because she didn't have the right job title. Do you understand how absurd that sounds to me?" His voice was faint, stripped of authority. "Sir, this is unexpected." "Unexpected," Harrison repeated, his tone razor-edged. "What's unexpected is that Allied command had to intervene to discover talent you've ignored for 18 months. What's unexpected is that you defended mediocrity instead of nurturing excellence. The words weren't just about her anymore. They were about a system, a culture, a blind devotion to process over performance. Sat back, her breath shallow, her heart hammering. She should have felt triumphant, vindicated, but instead she felt exposed. Every secret hour, every hidden session, every risk she had taken laid bare in the span of minutes. She had proven herself, yes, but she had also revealed herself. Harrison's eyes turned back to her, and for the first time they softened, not with pity but with recognition. "Lewis," he said, his voice quieter now, "do you know what you've just done?" She swallowed, her throat dry. "I've demonstrated capability, sir." "No," he said firmly. "You've just changed the balance of this command. Effective immediately, you are reassigned to precision marksmanship duties under my authorization." Gasps broke around her. Mitchell's hands clenched into fists, looked stricken, stared at the ground. Tried to object one last time, her words desperate. "Sir, protocol." "Protocol," Harrison thundered, "requires achieving mission objectives. This woman just did what your men could not. End of discussion." The verdict was final. Vision blurred slightly, a rush of adrenaline and disbelief colliding in her veins. She had dreamed of this moment, not the path that led here, not the confrontation, but the simple act of being seen, of being recognized for what she could do rather than what her paperwork said. And yet beneath the relief, another emotion stirred: fear. What came next? Would they accept her or hate her more? Would this recognition liberate her or paint a target on her back? Her grandfather's voice echoed from years past, soft and steady. "Dignity doesn't argue. It proves itself in silence." She had done that today, but at what cost? The wind swept across the range, carrying away the smoke, the echoes of gunfire, the mutters of disbelief. The mountains stood silent, as if they had always known this moment would come. Lowered her eyes, her hands trembling slightly against the cold steel of the... She wasn't the quartermaster anymore. She wasn't invisible. She was the marksman who had forced the world to see her. But in the silence that followed, one truth remained. In proving herself, she had shattered the order of Fort Sterling. And shattered orders don't heal quietly. The real battle was only beginning. How do you live after breaking the order that defined you? The base was quieter in the days that followed, but it wasn't peace. It was tension, thick, heavy, unspoken. Felt it in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in the barracks. The silence wasn't absence. It was resistance. Before she had been invisible, an afterthought. Now she was unavoidable. Soldiers who once brushed past her without notice now turned to stare, some with awe, some with envy, most with suspicion. The laughter that used to echo when she entered a room was gone, replaced by whispers that stopped the moment she drew close. Her new assignment, Admiral Harrison's directive, had shaken the chain of command to its core. She was officially transferred out of the depot, attached instead to the marksmanship program under the Admiral's personal oversight. On paper, it was a promotion. In reality, it was an earthquake. Mitchell took it hardest. He had built his identity around being Fort Sterling's marksman, the chosen one, the man whose position was never questioned. Watching dismantle him on the range had left him pale, hollow-eyed. But humiliation didn't soften him. It hardened him into something sharper, more dangerous. She felt it in his gaze when their paths crossed. Cold, measuring, like he was waiting for her to falter so he could reclaim the ground she'd taken. And weren't much different. Their jokes had vanished, but the hostility hadn't. Now it was quieter, buried under forced professionalism. They kept their distance, but their resentment followed her like a shadow. Even Major, who had tried to bar her from the rifle in the first place, carried herself with brittle composure. She gave assignments in clipped tones, avoided her eyes, but the tension in her jaw betrayed what she couldn't say. "You've embarrassed me. You've broken something I can't fix." And then there was Sergeant Major Williams. He had always embodied procedure, the embodiment of the phrase, "stay in your lane." Now, stripped of the authority to box her in, he looked at her with a mixture of disdain and suspicion. Not because she lacked skill, she had proven that, but because her existence had undermined the very system he lived by. To him, she wasn't just a challenge. She was a threat. Carried their stares with her everywhere she went. The irony was sharp. She had dreamed of being seen for so long, trained for it in silence, longed for the moment someone would recognize her ability. And now that the moment had come, she found herself longing for invisibility again. Recognition didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exposure. At night in her small quarters, she lay awake listening to the hum of the heater, her thoughts restless. Doubt crept in where confidence should have been. What if they're right? What if I don't belong here? She thought of her grandfather again, the steady man who had taught her patience as much as he had taught her marksmanship. He had told her once, after a long day on the hills when her shots had fallen short, "The mountain doesn't care if you miss. Only you do. And if you care enough, you'll try again until the mountain respects you." She clung to that. The mountain had respected her on the range, but the people, that was another battle. Admiral Harrison, however, gave her no time for doubt. Within days, he summoned her for private instruction. Unlike the others, he didn't look at her with suspicion or resentment. His gaze was clinical, sharp, but not unkind. He asked questions that revealed more about her than any report could. "How long have you been training outside the depot?" She hesitated, then answered honestly, "Over a year, sir." "With what weapon?" .338, civilian build. His eyebrows rose, but he didn't scold. He nodded. "That explains the discipline and the intuition." Then quieter, "You've been doing this alone?" "Yes, sir." Something flickered in his eyes, respect, maybe, or recognition. Their sessions were grueling, not in the way of physical endurance, but in precision. Harrison wasn't interested in seeing if she could shoot straight. She had already proven that. He wanted to know if she could hold under pressure, if her calm could survive when the shot wasn't just about accuracy but consequence. He would stand behind her, silent, and then bark a correction mid-breath, forcing her to recover. He would demand shots from impossible positions, uphill, downhill, through shifting gusts. He timed her transitions, cut her windows in half, demanded decisions in seconds. And every time she steadied herself, every time she fired true, a part of her disbelief eased. Maybe I do belong here. But the weight never fully lifted. Because outside those sessions, the backlash only grew. Rumors spread fast. Some said Harrison had handpicked her as his project. Others whispered darker suspicions, that she had manipulated her way into the demonstration, that she had been planning it all along, that she had embarrassed the base deliberately. She found notes slipped under her door, scribbled insults, half-hearted threats. "Stay in your lane. You'll never last. One lucky day doesn't make a soldier." She burned them quietly, never mentioning them to anyone. But the words clung like smoke. Even the allies she hadn't expected, a handful of junior soldiers who admired her performance, didn't approach her openly. Their encouragement came in brief nods, in whispers when no one else was listening. They respected her, but they feared being seen on her side. She carried it all in silence. One evening, after a particularly brutal session with Harrison, she returned to her quarters and stared at herself in the mirror. Her uniform looked the same. Her face looked the same. But something in her eyes had changed. She whispered to her reflection, "Am I a soldier now, or just their mistake?" Her hands tightened on the edge of the sink. The truth was simple. She had proven herself once, but once was not enough. In the military, nothing was permanent. Respect had to be earned again and again until it wasn't questioned anymore. She couldn't argue her way into belonging. She couldn't fight their whispers with words. She could only prove, over and over, that what they thought impossible was already in her grasp. And deep down, she knew Harrison was waiting too. He had defended her, yes. He had authorized her, yes. But he hadn't guaranteed her. If she faltered now, if she showed weakness, if she cracked under the strain, he would walk away. That thought both terrified and steadied her, because it meant there was only one path forward. When the order came the following week, her pulse quickened. It wasn't training this time. It wasn't demonstration. It was operational. A live test, a scenario built not for show but for proof. Admiral Harrison would put her under fire, not with bullets but with stakes that mattered. And everyone would be watching, waiting, hopping, some for her to succeed, many for her to fail. She sat on the edge of her bunk that night, the Welsh wind rattling faintly at the window. She thought of the mountains again, the cold mornings with her grandfather, the weight of the in her 12-year-old hands. She thought of the laughter in the armory, the whispered doubts, the tribunal that had tried to bury her. And she thought of the roaring under her grip, the silence that followed, the target downrange burning with proof. Her reflection in the dark glass looked back at her with the question she hadn't yet answered. Am I enough? The order on her desk said she would find out soon. What if she failed now? The question haunted her in the days before the test. It whispered when she walked the corridors. It echoed in the silence of her quarters. It even pulsed in the quiet moments before sleep when the body softens but the mind refuses to rest. Failure didn't mean returning to obscurity. It meant something worse. It meant proving them right. Mitchell, Williams, everyone who had insisted she didn't belong. One slip, one missed shot, and she would confirm their prejudice. And this time there would be no second chances, no secret valleys to practice in, no shadows to hide her preparation. The order was clear. Live operational scenario, scheduled in 3 days, overseen by Admiral Harrison himself. Tried to steady herself with routine. Wake before dawn. Run. Eat quickly. Clean her rifle, not but her civilian, the one she trusted like a part of her own body. She handled it with reverence, her fingers running over the steel, the glass, the familiar grooves worn smooth by a year of lonely nights. In her mind she replayed Harrison's voice. You've proven yourself once. Now prove it wasn't luck. At night, dreams tangled with memory. She was back on her grandfather's farm, the hills misted in, the sheep scattered across uneven slopes. She could smell Pete's smoke, hear the distant bleating. He was beside her, broad-shouldered, steady, weathered by decades of hard living. Steady your breathing, he said, his Welsh accent thick and comforting. The mountain's bigger than you, it always will be. Respect it, match it. In the dream she raised the old, too big for her small frame, but she held it anyway. The wind tugged at her jacket, the sheep blurred, the trigger was stiff, but her hands were steady, always steady. And then the dream twisted. The hills became the base. The sheep became soldiers, laughing, whispering. The became the massive in her arms. She fired and missed, again, each round drifting wide, scattering the target. Mitchell's laughter rang like gunfire. His voice cut sharp. I told you, she's nothing but a clerk. She woke gasping, sweat soaking her sheets, the phantom recoil still trembling through her bones. During the day, she masked the fear with discipline. She spent hours in the range simulation room, not firing, just breathing, practicing calm. Inhale, exhale, count the seconds, heartbeat slow. The rifle, when she finally held it again, needed not only skill but serenity. She remembered Harrison's first private session. He had said something that stayed with her. Shooting isn't about dominance, it's about humility. Every bullet is a conversation between you and the world. If you don't listen, you'll miss. She had nodded then, but now the words returned like a riddle. Humility, listening. Could she hold that truth when her career hung in the balance? The base noticed her tension. They circled her like wolves, waiting for weakness. Mitchell walked past her in the mess hall one morning, pausing just long enough to mutter, "You won't last. One shot doesn't make a sniper." She didn't answer. Words wouldn't save her. Only proof would. Avoided her eyes. smirked behind her back. Even the younger soldiers, the ones who had whispered admiration after her demonstration, kept their distance. No one wanted to be seen standing with her. Only Harrison spoke to her directly, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're not here to impress them," he told her. "You're here to answer one question. When the moment comes, can you do it?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. The answer hadn't revealed itself yet. On the second night, she walked to the perimeter fence again, the same place she had stood before Harrison arrived. The mountains stretched beyond, vast and indifferent, their peaks painted in moonlight. The wind brushed cold across her face, carrying scents of earth and frost. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the doubts, not to the whispers, to the silence, to the mountains. Am I enough? The answer didn't come, but something inside her steadied. On the final morning before the test, she dressed slowly, pressed her uniform flat, tied her hair back. Her reflection stared at her from the mirror, eyes darker than before, shadowed by sleepless nights but sharpened by resolve. If she failed, she would be broken, but if she succeeded, she would never be invisible again. She whispered to her reflection, barely audible, "Dignity doesn't speak, it acts." When she walked into the briefing room that afternoon, Harrison was waiting. His presence filled the space like gravity, his calm more commanding than any shout. He laid a file on the table, thin, simple, inside, coordinates, target profiles, conditions. "This is not training," he said. "This is evaluation. Tomorrow you will engage targets under time constraints, variable positions, operational distances, real conditions, no excuses." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Do you understand?" His voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Yes, sir." "Good," he said. "Then rest. Tomorrow decides everything." As she left the room, she knew sleep would not come, but she also knew something else. She was ready. Ready not because they believed in her, not because she had been chosen, but because the mountains had made her ready long before the base ever knew her name. The night stretched long, sleepless. She lay in the dark, listening to her own breath, her hand resting lightly on the rifle case beside her bunk. When dawn came, she rose without hesitation. The time for fear was over. The test had arrived. What does pressure feel like when the world is waiting for you to fail? Felt it in the air that morning, a current that hummed against her skin as she stepped onto the range. Soldiers gathered along the sidelines, their boots crunching in frost, their breath steaming in the cold. She had been invisible once, a shadow in the depot. Now every eye was on her, some sharp with resentment, others with curiosity, a few with the faint glow of hope. And in the center of them all stood Admiral Harrison. His presence cut through the murmurs. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was command enough. He watched her approach, his arms behind his back, his posture steady as the mountains themselves. "Lewis," he said when she reached him, "today you prove if what I saw last week was talent or anomaly." "Yes, sir." His gaze lingered, measuring, searching for cracks. "Targets will be engaged at 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters. Multiple angles, variable positions. You will have limited time for each. You miss. You move on, no excuses." His throat tightened, but she nodded, understood. "And remember this," Harrison added, his voice low. "They don't want you to succeed, that's the pressure. Ignore them, listen to the rifle, listen to the wind, nothing else matters." She breathed once deeply, as though pulling strength from the air itself. Then she moved toward the bench where they waited, gleaming under the pale sun. The weapon felt familiar now, no longer forbidden, no longer borrowed. It was weight, steel, promise. Mitchell stood with arms crossed, his face pale with fury masked as indifference. Whispered something under his breath, smirked. Heard none of it. She was already listening to the world beyond, the wind, the silence, the waiting mountains. "Ready," she said. Harrison's voice carried across the range. "Begin." The first target, 800 meters uphill angle partial cover, a time window of 15 seconds. Settled into position, she read the wind through the shift of grass, the whisper against her cheek, adjusted, fired. The steel plate sang with the impact, center hit. The crowd stirred, not luck, not chance, controlled precision. Next, 1,000 meters crosswind angled shot. She adjusted half a click, inhaled, paused on the exhale, fired. Bullseye. The murmurs grew louder, soldiers shifting uncomfortably. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Arms folded across her chest, her face locked in stony disapproval. Next, Harrison commanded. 1,200 meters, the hardest, a 30-second clock. The wind had shifted again, fickle, sharp. She watched it play across the terrain, subtle movements in brush and dust. Her grandfather's voice returned like a ghost, respect the mountain, match it. She adjusted. Her finger pressed the trigger, smooth, steady. The thundered, the target snapped, dead center. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then a ripple passed through the gathered soldiers, disbelief, frustration, awe. Harrison's voice broke through, calm but resonant. Reset, second sequence. The test wasn't over, it had only begun. The next round of targets came faster. Positions shifted, prone to kneeling, kneeling to standing, standing to supported crouch. Each demanded adaptation, each cut her margin thinner. At 800 meters, she adjusted and hit. At 1,000, she compensated for gusts mid-breath and hit. At 1,200, with seconds to spare, she steadied, fired, and landed within an inch of center. Her arms ached from transitions. Her lungs burned, but her rhythm held. By the third sequence, sweat clung to her spine despite the cold. Her muscles trembled from the strain of holding the heavy rifle through rapid shifts. But every movement was a memory, every adjustment a lesson she had carved into herself during those lonely weekends on the Welsh hills. She remembered firing from uneven rocks, from damp ground, from ridges where wind clawed at her balance. She remembered forcing herself to reset faster, to breathe slower, to believe in calculations when her body wanted to panic. Now it paid off. Shot after shot struck home. Not always bullseyes, but always within lethal accuracy. Consistency, precision, control. By the time Harrison called cease, she had fired 36 rounds in under 12 minutes. 35 had landed true. One had strayed, a near miss an inch outside the inner ring. She set the rifle down gently, her hands trembling from exertion, her heart pounding. She forced her breathing calm. The silence that followed was different from before, not disbelieving, not mocking, something heavier, something harder. Respect. It was reluctant, grudging, but undeniable. Even those who hated her most could not dismiss what they had seen. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes on the target's downrange, the pattern of hits that spoke louder than any speech. Then he turned to the soldiers gathered, his voice cutting through the cold like steel. This, he said, gesturing to the targets, is competence, not credentials, not politics, not tradition, competence. His gaze swept across Mitchell, Williams, all of them shrinking under the weight of his words. You've wasted a year suppressing talent that could have advanced this entire base. You chose mediocrity over excellence, and you dare call it discipline. No one answered, no one dared. Then Harrison turned too, his eyes softened just slightly. You've proven yourself again, but proof comes with consequence. From this moment you are no longer quartermaster, you are sniper. The words landed heavier than any order she had ever received. Not just a title, not just recognition, a transformation. But with it came weight. She felt it press against her shoulders, her chest. The base would not accept this easily. The resentment already brewing would only deepen. She was stepping into a role that made her a symbol, not just a soldier. And symbols carry burdens. As she stood there, the mountain wind curling around her, she realized something Harrison hadn't said. This wasn't the end of her proving. It was only the beginning. Because every mission from here on would not just be for the objective. It would be for her place, her dignity, her right to exist in the role she had carved for herself. She picked up the one last time that morning, cleaned it with trembling but careful hands. Around her, silence lingered, not disbelief this time, but the uneasy quiet of an order shattered. For the first time in her life at Fort Sterling, she wasn't invisible. And sometimes, being seen is its own battlefield. What does it mean when the first time truly matters? The briefing room was silent except for the low hum of the projector. Faces leaned forward under dim light, shadows etched into tired skin. The mission was small on paper: reconnaissance escort in a valley 2 hours east, hostile activity suspected. Nothing heroic, nothing glamorous, but everyone in the room understood. There was no such thing as routine when rifles were involved. And for it wasn't routine at all. It was her first assignment as sniper. No simulation, no demonstration. This was real, a live deployment where the shots weren't for applause or recognition. They were for survival. Admiral Harrison himself stood at the front, speaking in clipped tones. Our convoy will move into the valley at 0500. Intelligence suggests insurgent spotters have been testing response times. Ambush is possible. Counter-sniper overwatch required. He paused, his eyes settling on her, making sure everyone saw it. Lewis will take overwatch position. Whispers rippled, Mitchell's jaw clenched. Eyes flashed with barely contained disdain, but no one objected aloud. Harrison's authority was final. Sat stiff, her fingers curled around the file. She had rehearsed this moment in her head for years, and yet the weight of it pressed into her ribs like a hand. This wasn't a mountain practice. This wasn't a staged test. This was life. The men in that convoy would either live or die depending on what she saw, what she did, what she hit or failed to. That night she packed her gear slowly, methodically. The lei in its case, gleaming under the dim barracks light. She checked each round twice, her hands steady though her heart refused to quiet. When sleep came, it was shallow, broken by dreams of shadows on ridges, echoes of gunfire, faces she couldn't quite see. At dawn, the convoy rolled out. The valley loomed before them, steep ridges, jagged rocks, terrain made for ambush. Clouds hung low, swallowing the light. The kind of day where vision faltered, where distance was deceptive, where the air itself seemed to hold secrets. Climbed with her spotter, a young corporal named Finch, assigned reluctantly. He had been told to follow orders, not to believe in her. His silence said as much. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley. She set up the steel heavy but grounding in her hands. The world narrowed again, not to applause this time, not to disbelief or judgment. Only to the valley, the convoy below, the possibility of danger above. Hours passed in silence. The wind shifted, birds moved, nothing. Then Finch stiffened. Movement, 12 o'clock, high ridge. Adjusted the scope. Shadows flickered against rock, a glint of glass scope reflection. Sniper. Her breath slowed. The convoy below was unaware, their engines rumbling steady, their formation vulnerable. One shot could break them. She measured distance, 1,100 meters, crosswind shifting. The target moved slowly, settling, preparing to fire. Pulse slowed, not quickened. This was what she had trained for. This was the conversation with the world her grandfather had spoken of. Respect the mountain. Match it. She exhaled, the roared. The figure dropped, the glint vanishing into dust. Finch swore softly, disbelief etched into his voice. First shot hit, but didn't answer. Her eyes were already scanning. Another glint, second ridge, different angle, not one sniper, two. Her chest tightened. She adjusted fast, recalculated. 900 meters, partial cover, seconds before he had his shot lined. She fired, steel cracked. The figure fell sideways. Below, the convoy halted briefly, radios crackling. Harrison's voice carried through Finch's headset, calm but edged. Status. Finch hesitated, then answered. Overwatch neutralized 2 threats. Convoy clear. Lowered the rifle slowly. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what she had just done. Lives had been in her scope, and because of her, those lives continued. The convoy resumed, engines echoing off the valley walls. Finch looked at her differently now, not with suspicion, not with dismissal, but with something approaching respect. He didn't say it, but his silence was no longer doubt. It was acknowledgement. Hours later, when the convoy returned safe, Harrison sought her out. His words were brief, but his eyes carried weight. "You listened," he said. "That's why you hit, remember that, every mission, every shot." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Back in her quarters that night, she sat in silence. The rifle rested in its case beside her bunk, but her mind replayed the valley, the shots, the stillness that followed. She thought of her grandfather again, his voice steady, unshaken. "The mountain doesn't care if you miss, only you do." She hadn't missed, but the weight of not missing pressed on her all the same. Because now she understood the truth of what she had wanted all along. It wasn't about proving herself to Mitchell or Williams. It wasn't even about proving herself to Harrison. It was about the lives in the convoy, the silence after the shot, the dignity of doing what needed to be done without fanfare, without applause. She sat there for a long time, the wind outside rattling against the glass, her breath slow, her hands finally still. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible, and she didn't feel exposed. She simply felt present. And in that presence came clarity. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't argue, doesn't shout, doesn't demand recognition. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.